Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Gar Borras' Time Machine. Gar, this is episode number 83, and this is a one I've been wanting to do for a while. Today we're going to be talking about, for episode number 83, the history of Betty Boop. Now, when I initially brought the idea of doing this, you were very excited, so why don't you share with us, your history with Betty Boop and how you first became a fan?
When I was a kid, back in the 60s, I remember watching the popular cartoon TV shows at that time, which were Sheriff John and and a bunch of other type of cartoon shows, and those shows used to show many different type of cartoons. It'd be a mixture of like Popeye and all of that stuff. And I remember distinctly as a kid, because I was very young at the time, elementary school, age, and I remember. When I would watch those cartoons, I would see her character.
Yeah.
And, you have to understand that all of these, popular cartoon characters of the 1960s were in full bloom at that time. And the Popeye cartoons and the Betty Boop cartoons, and there were other ones, too, that were from earlier years, from the 1920s and the 1930s and things like that. When cartoons first started having sound in the cartoons, they called them talk cartoons. Talk cartoons, yeah. All one word, talk cartoons.
Yeah.
And so I would be watching those, and they were so different from what was going on at that time. The quick draw McGraw, and the stuff that was real popular in the 60s.
Yeah.
And then also another thing that was a thing that stood out at that time is a lot of the modern cartoons that I was watching at that time were in color, and yet the Popeye ones and the Betty Boop ones and the other ones from the 1930s were in black and white.
Yes.
So there was a difference that was going on there. So when you're a child and you're just watching this stuff kind of parading in front of you on your TV, and I think the thing that stood out the most to me is Betty Boop seemed to be a bit more adult.
Yes.
Than child. Even though they were, I was watching it with other child targeted cartoons.
Yeah.
Even as a child, it seemed that the target of it and everything like that was for a more mature, more older audience.
Yeah.
And the thing about her character, which was so different from any other female character that I was seeing at that time, was she exuded a sexuality.
Yes.
And the thing that that needs to be kept in mind is when these cartoons were being made back in the 1920s and the 1930s, that type of content was really considered very racy and very blue and very, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Gar.
You know what
I mean? Very inappropriate for children.
Yeah,
You see what I mean?
yeah. You know, even
when they made the Betty Boop character, they really were not as much targeting children with that. I personally think it was the first cartoons that were targeted towards an audience that was older than children.
Yeah, you know, in doing the research for today's episode, I found a couple interesting things to kind of point that out. I mean, even in the various descriptions I was reading on Betty Boop, it would say that many of the cartoons had adult risque scenes. Now, risque is a kind of it's a fancy word for like inappropriate, yeah, without actually coming out and saying it. You know, and the interesting thing, we should point out that the one that put out Betty Boop was, of all people, Fleischer Studios, Max Fleischer, who I think Betty Boop actually predates, you know, the Superman cartoon, but Fleischer Studios, a few years down the line, they would also be famous for those early Superman cartoons. So that particular studio was really into animation. And just to kind of give people a little background on Betty Boop, I was reading, Betty Boop is a cartoon character created by Max Fleischer with Graham Natwick, who was an American animator. There were 90 theatrical cartoons that were released between 1930 and 1939 starring Betty Boop. Now, as we've discussed in many past episodes, Gar, and you even explained when you were a child, you experienced this yourself when you go to the movies. I mean, the 1930s really even predates you, but when you were a kid, they were also have these theatrical cartoons before the movie, and so like Betty Boop premieres in 1930, but could you imagine going to the movie theater as a child and seeing one of these cartoons before a main feature?
Well, you know, I think that at that what's kind of lost in context to all of this is the time period when Betty Boop was first introduced, which was the 1920s.
Yes.
Now, exactly when, you know, I don't know if it was early 1920s or mid or late 1920s, but it was basically the 1920s. Mm-hmm. And during the 1920s, what was really popular, you know, and you see it in old movies from you know, the first talkies. Because, you know, the first talkie movies, you know, had a lot of that 1920s backdrop to their movies, even though the movies came out in the 30s.
Yes.
The movies had a 1920s backdrop in the time periods that they were depicting in their movies. And what you saw a lot of was jazz music that was real popular in the 1920s.
Yes.
But what's lost in context is that whole jazz thing was very attractive to the rebellious segments of society that were rebelling against very conservative views of that time period.
Yes.
Which inappropriate behavior and things like that. So the reason why you saw a lot of that in those early talkie movies was because there was so much inappropriate behavior that was going on in the 1920s.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Drinking was at its apex, where and partying was at its apex, and so when you associated jazz, you also saw a lot of drinking. You saw a lot of women in what was considered inappropriate outfits of the time.
Yeah.
And you saw, and you see, all you have to do is go back and pick any movie from the early talkies in the 1930s, and you're going to see this.
Yeah.
And so this really kind of explains where Betty Boop was born from. She was born out of excessive drinking, what was considered inappropriate music, which jazz was considered because it was associated with all of these other inappropriate behaviors. Speakeasies were inappropriate places to be.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? It was all inappropriate for the 1920s. And so Betty Boop was born out of this because she was kind of a safe character to depict, because she wasn't an actual human being doing these things. You see what I mean? And she was still dressed inappropriately, because when you see the first, not the very first, because the very first she was actually an animal. She was a
poodle.
A French poodle.
Yeah.
But by the time she developed into a human form and everything like that, she was dressed very inappropriately. With the garter showing. All of that stuff is inappropriate. I mean, the 1920s is when they tried to institute prohibition.
Sure.
Which was the conservative side of society, trying to, force their views on the rest of society. And the rest of society wound up, rejecting that in a big way later on. So there was a lot of turmoil and upheaval, and it was all about all of this inappropriate stuff that was just out of control in the 1920s. Now, they don't depict gangsters as much.
No.
Because that's part of the 1920s. But what they're not talking about that. They're talking about social. And that's what the Time Machine is about. The Time Machine is about pop culture, and pop culture is driven by the social machine of the time.
Sure. Gar, and I learned quite a few things that I always do in doing the research for today's episode. And a couple of things I want to kind of touch on that you just mentioned. I never knew that in the very early version of Betty Boop was not even a human. It was a French poodle. And so, to be able to go online and see kind of images of that, it's like, wow. Because, like we said, she dates back to the 1930s, right after the Great Depression has taken place. And what's interesting about it is, Betty Boop kind of looks somewhat like a French poodle. You could kind of see that. But I was even reading where they said she went from being a French poodle to kind of they humanized her. Which is kind of like, you wonder where Max Fleischer's brain was going. And final thing I kind of want to touch on with you, because you've mentioned several times about what a huge fan you are of jazz music. Now, I was wondering, when you first are seeing Betty Boop for the first, because I'll be honest, when I came across Betty Boop for the first time, I'm not really listening to the jazz music in the background or thinking about anything that is even based on the jazz music scene. But it's kind of an interesting part of the backstory, and the fact that you are such a fan of jazz music. But I'm wondering, did you even pick up on any of that when you saw Betty Boop for the very first time?
Oh, absolutely not. But to put things in perspective, jazz music in the 1920s.
Yeah, it was big.
What? No, that's not where I'm going.
Okay.
Jazz music in the 1920s was considered the same way heavy metal is considered now.
Wow, yeah.
because I mean, going all the way back to the 1980s, people have been trying to attach the evils of society to heavy metal.
Yes, yes.
The PMRC. People that lived in the 1980s will know what PMRC is.
Yes.
It was the conservative side of society trying to push, their views on the rest of everybody, and making, and controlling what they determined was inappropriate at that time.
Yeah.
And PMRC was trying to associate heavy metal with all of the horrible things that were going on in society.
Yeah.
For example, Ozzy Osbourne being sued by the family of their child that committed suicide, and the family wanted to blame it on Ozzy Osbourne, on a song that Ozzy Osbourne had released, rather than looking within and the family actually looking at themselves as what they might have played part in their son's suicide.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a complete and total trying to blame probably what had a lot more to do with that family, but they were trying to blame it on someone else that was playing heavy metal music.
Sure.
So, so in the 1920s, that was the exact same way that society was viewing jazz. All of these inappropriate behaviors, women doing things sexually that were considered inappropriate behavior in the 1920s was associated with jazz music. The way that people dressed that were considered inappropriate was associated with jazz music. All of the inappropriate behaviors that we now have experienced dating all the way back to the 80s about heavy metal is exactly the way that society looked at jazz music in the 1920s. And that has all been lost over the years. And so that's the beauty of the time machine is, for people like me, that remember watching it back in the 1960s when I was a child, and knowing all of this really kind of helps you to understand why Betty Boop was so popular, because she was a safe way. Because just like today, there are people that like to watch. Or like to dabble in things that are considered racy or inappropriate, or nowadays, you know what I mean?
Sure.
They live their daily lives in the popular way, the scope, and what society dictates how you're supposed to behave in society. But people still like to dabble in the little areas that are still inappropriate.
Sure.
It's kind of like, the interest in scary movies, or you see what I'm saying, or the interest in the dark subject matter of heavy metal. All of those are, we spend our daily lives in the safe zone, but we still want to dabble in these little areas, but we still want to stay safe. And that is exactly what Betty Boop was in the 1920s. She was that safe area where she was displaying inappropriate things, but those inappropriate things were the things that made her popular in the 1920s.
Yeah, Garb, interesting thing too about Betty Boop, if you think about it, there has never been another cartoon or animated character that was sexualized in such a way, and I think that's what makes Betty Boop so iconic. Is there's never been anything like her before her time or since her time, and just to kind of talk a little more about the people that created Betty Boop, it said on November 12th, 1934, Grim Natwick, he was one of the animators that helped create Betty Boop. He was hired by, of all places, Walt Disney Animated Studios, where he became the lead animator for Snow White. He also helped to animate Mickey Mouse in Fantasia, Mr. Magoo, Popeye, Felix the Cat. Now, I bring this all up because often as we do in our episodes, you find out like somebody like this, Betty Boop was, what kind of first brought him fame, but then he would go on to work on something like Snow White. He'd go on to work, and Felix the Cat. And if you kind of look at Felix and Betty Boop, even by different studios, they somewhat look the same, you know what I mean? There's some similarity. And it's kind of interesting that this guy got to start with Betty Boop and he'd go on to all these other successful projects.
Well, Betty Boop in the 1920s, it was the cartoon equivalent to Marilyn Monroe in the 1950s.
Yes, yeah.
And that is the truth, because just like Marilyn Monroe exhibited all of those same things, there was the side of Marilyn Monroe of the inappropriate behavior, aka the very first issue of Playboy, having her naked pictorial in there, and all of this, so there are like major parallels when you compare, even though one was a cartoon and one was actually human. But Betty Boop really was the cartoon equivalent to Marilyn Monroe. And just like Marilyn Monroe has become an iconic, personality over the years, and where when you go into novelty shops and have their section where their collectibles, like the Lucy plates and the this and the that, you're still going to find the Betty Boop section. Just like you're also going to find Marilyn Monroe. You're going to find the Marilyn Monroe section. You're going to find the Frank Sinatra section.
Elvis.
And the Elvis and all of the others that have become icons over the year. Betty Boop has lasted the longest of all of them because she started way before any of the rest of them. But there is nothing that is in any of those novelty shops that people go in to buy previous to Betty Boop.
Sure. And of course, that's why, Betty Boop is one of the most iconic animated pop culture characters in history, Gar. And just kind of push that home, Betty Boop can be best described as a flapper-style woman with a short dress, large round eyes, and a baby-like face, and an adult curvy body. Now, what a combination, right there.
Well, okay, let's talk about the definition of flapper.
Please do, because
that really, goes right back to what I was saying about inappropriate behavior.
Yeah.
Because the actual definition of flapper, it has become lost over the years.
Sure.
And basically, what a flapper was in the 1920s was a girl in, could be between 16 and early 20s.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? Oh. And a flapper represented the girls that had a distaste for the conservative pressures of society. How you should dress, how you should talk, what you should be liking, all of these things were rejected by flapper girls, and that's the reason why flapper girls embraced jazz music, they embraced drinking, they embraced dancing, and dancing at that time was considered very sexual, outwardly sexual behavior by the ultra conservatives at that time.
Yeah.
You know, all of this stuff that you used to see that are depicted in movies about, you know, jazz, where you're seeing how society is actually having an absolute blast, is because just like the 1980s had excessive partying by all the rockers, and I was part of that, you know, that part of society back in the 1980s.
Sure.
Well, back in the 1920s, that excessive partying was going on just like in the 1980s.
Yeah,
but back in the 1920s, you know, heroin was legal back in those days.
Wow.
Cocaine was legal back in those days. So there were elements of society that were dabbling in those things. You know, but they were dabbling in those things because there was no laws telling anybody, you know, that they couldn't do any of those things back in the 1920s. And, you know, so all of this underground stuff that was going on in the 1920s, you know, because society was very naive about a lot of this stuff, it was just in full bloom at that time, and that's why they call it the Roaring Twenties.
Yes, sir.
It is a completely lost thing in history that people just, it's all faded now.
Yeah,
but the Roaring Twenties have a lot in common
with the
80s, and, you know, how, you know, that whole hard rock, heavy metal, and excessive partying was going on. A lot of, you know, how women were dressing back in the 1980s.
Yeah.
I mean, I loved being a musician, going to those shows and just seeing the women in the crowd and how they were dressed. It was incredible if you're a young male.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh, sure. And you know,
and just like the 1920s, there was inappropriate dress going on in the Roaring Twenties in these jazz places. So, you know, so we look at jazz music as jazz music, but we're, you know, the whole thing is jazz music was for the it was heavily popular at the time.
Yeah.
But yet it had the label of inappropriate all over it.
Yeah, and of course, you know, Gar, I don't know this, or I haven't researched it, but I dare say that Betty Boop probably predates when there were even any kind of strip club. But see, I'm glad you kind of explained what a flapper is, because I was reading that, and at first I thought, okay, a flapper must be maybe like somebody that sings or entertains. Like
they were the bad girls.
Yeah. And then Betty Boop.
A flapper was a bad girl. She was doing all the things that other women in society considered what the bad girls do. And just like in the 1980s, what the girls were doing that were hanging around with the bands, those were the bad girls. And the craziest thing is now all of those bad girls from the 1980s are somebody's aunt.
Yeah.
Somebody's
grandmother. Yeah.
You know what I mean? But at the time, those girls were engaged in very inappropriate behavior, you know, that they don't want to really talk about anymore. What they were doing back in the 1980s. Well, that same stuff was going on.
Yeah.
You know, for my time period, those people that were partying back and doing all of that inappropriate behavior back in the 1920s are my grandparents.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying? And because I'm of that generation where that's where they would be in the scheme of things.
Yeah. So basically,
it's so crazy to think that people that we interact today with were heavily engaged with inappropriate behavior, but yet now at this stage of their lives, it's really not something that they really want to talk about, and they really do not want to glorify, with the exception of people like me.
Yeah. And Gar, it's funny we sit here and laugh about, but I mean, kind of what you're saying, the jazz music of the 1920s and 30s, that was that era's kind of rebellion form of music, and it's kind of interesting to, I guess every era kind of has their own form of rebellion, but also when you first look at Betty Boop, what makes it so somewhat controversial, inappropriate is we don't really have any idea. Is Betty Boop a teenager? Is she an adult? Is she a kid? I mean, very, very short. So you look at her initially, kind of looks like a cross between an adult or very short person, and that's kind of, I think, what makes it, because depending on, she has that kind of baby-like face, and you're like, okay, what's her age? And if you think she's like 16 or 17, then the dressing and everything she's depicting is very inappropriate. But it's kind of, we never really do know, except you just assume she's somewhat of adult age.
Well, I in doing the research.
Yeah, sure.
Betty Boop was really. There's one that is a hearsay, and the other one has more of documented proof.
Sure.
There was a woman that eventually wound up suing, because of basically she was saying that the Betty Boop character was based on her.
Yeah.
And all of the things that she did, it was like a cartoon
version of her
of everything. And there were a lot of things that she was doing in her act, that were definitely part of Betty Boop. It was part of her stage act in the 1930s that she said "boop boop badoo."
Yeah.
Which Betty Boop totally ripped that off from her.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth of the matter is that is the documented one where there is documented proof that there are things of that particular person's character that were taken and used in the cartoon.
Yeah, well,
the other one is, Betty Boop looks so much like her.
Yeah.
And every time I see pictures of this particular silent era icon, but Betty Boop looks so much like her. The shape of her head, her face, and everything.
Yeah.
If you look at pictures of Clara Bow,
mm-hmm.
Clara Bow was an icon of the silent movie era. And Betty Boop looks so much like Clara Bow. It's scary.
Yeah.
It really is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, there is no documented proof that the Betty Boop character is based on Clara Bow. But when you look at pictures of Clara Bow and you look at Betty Boop, it's really scary how much, more so than the other one, that there's documented proof. Because, so who knows? This is all speculation. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Because there is no documented proof. But, man, she looks so much like Clara Bow.
Hey, Gar, if I could...
And Clara Bow in the 1920s was a bad girl.
Yeah.
She was a flapper.
Wow. Yeah, hey Gar, if I could fill in some of the holes here regarding the lawsuit, what I found out said American singer Helen Kane filed a lawsuit against Fleischer Studios in 1932 because she felt that the Betty Boop character was based off of her looks and singing voice. The court case was won by Fleischer Studios because the court found that Helen Kane could not prove she originated that type of jazz music. It was saying other people at the time, not just her, were very famous for using kind of that same type of scat vocal. She could not prove that Boop 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 a Doop was something originated by her. So I guess in order
she did not originate. The lady that sued
Helen Kane
actually took everything that she was using in her act and ripped it off from other people previous to her.
Yeah.
She didn't think that they were going to be able to prove that in a court of law.
Yeah.
And they did. And that is why she lost.
Yeah.
Is because they actually showed proof that Helen Kane, that's her name?
Yeah.
Helen Kane actually ripped off her what she was doing in her act from previous acts before her. And they proved it in a court of law. So you can't sue somebody for something that you were using in your act that you ripped off from somebody else.
Yeah.
And now you're calling it your own.
See, and she thought,
and the real reason that Helen Kane did this was because her career was waning at the time, and the money wasn't coming in, and so she was looking for a payday, some kind of payday, because $250,000 back then was the equivalent of millions of dollars today.
Yeah, and sadly, when her name comes up, she's more remembered as the person that sued Fleischer Studios over, Betty Boop.
It's not Fleischer, it's Fleischer.
Fleischer. Thank you, Gar.
Fleischer Studios.
Yeah, thank you, Gar. Getting the name right.
Fleischer would be Flasher.
Yeah, Fleischer. I apologize, but thank you for correcting me, because we do want to get the names correct. That's just my error there. It said the court case also helped Fleischer Studios cement Betty Boop standing as an original character, so much to the point that I was reading, they had a couple episodes where Betty Boop was in court and was actually kind of a judge in one of them, and this was kind of the studio's kind of way of laughing about the fact that they won the case. So kind of a case of
they showed proof.
Yeah.
And in that lawsuit, it actually came out, and part of that proof that Betty Boop was actually based on a black person before it actually metamorphosized into a white person.
Yeah.
And the biggest reason why that is still cannot be debated is because when you look at Betty Boop's hair,
you can see that.
That hairstyle does not depict the hairstyle of white women in the 1920s. That hairstyle depicts the hairstyles of black women in the 1920s. And that hairstyle has stayed throughout the entire history of Betty Boop.
Yeah.
That black woman's hairstyle stayed on Betty Boop the entire time.
And let me ask you
that was never a white woman's hairstyle.
Yeah, and that's something, like you said, that has never been able to be confirmed or denied. Now, let me ask you, how much...
It has.
Okay.
It has, because that was part of why they won that lawsuit. That was part of their proof in that lawsuit.
I missed that. Okay, wow, Gar. And now let me ask you, I was kind of thinking a little bit about this. You know, the original 1930 version of Betty Boop and those theatrical cartoons, it's black and white, obviously, because black and white was what was around back then. And it looks very different once they colorized Betty Boop. Now, I know you're a huge fan of the black and white era, but let me ask you, once Betty Boop gets colorized, do you think people are paying more attention to the detail? Because the black and white looks kind of grainy. The details don't necessarily stand out. Or I almost think when Betty Boop is colorized, you notice more of a sexualization of the character, if you know what I mean.
Well, you know, that's a distinct possibility.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because once you colorize things, then you can actually see things in different lights.
Yeah.
Now, I personally never watched a colorized version.
Okay.
But in doing the research, the very first attempt to colorize any cartoon was when they attempted to colorize a Betty Boop cartoon. But back in those days, they had to do it by hand.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have the technology that allowed for much better colorization that wound up occurring later on. So when they did it by hand during that time, the quality of the colorization was horrible.
Yeah.
And so it really did not go over well.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You know, and it's just because of the technology that was available at that time, not the fact that it was colorized.
Yeah.
It was actually the you know how well it was done. It was horribly done at that time.
Yeah. And of course, Betty Boop was a boundary-pushing character, Gar, and many of the original Betty Boop cartoons from the 1930s were considered to be raunchy adult topics such as infidelity, drunkenness, drug use, and I don't know if, like, when we're watching some of these cartoons, if you really notice right away. I mean, years later, like when you're doing research for today's episode, it's more apparent than maybe the first time I'm watching a Betty Boop cartoon, you know, as a child. But it was always kind of there. But I don't know if it's just a case that people weren't really paying attention. They secretly liked what they were seeing. You know, I don't know.
Well, it's always the appropriate aspects of society always having that interest in the macabre.
Yeah.
Always having that interest in the inappropriate. You know, they want to stay in their safe area where they personally are behaving appropriately.
Yeah,
but they like to be entertained, you know, by things, you know, the fascination with the inappropriate.
Yeah,
it's not actually doing, but it's the fascination, and that is, I think Betty Boop is one of those first documented proof of society's fascination with the inappropriate and the dark side.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You know, nowadays you see all kinds of things referred. You know, I'm looking at what's on TV, and there's a show, The Dark Side of This, or The Dark Side of the Ring, or The Dark Side of, you know, and basically that show is now showing, the dark side of being in wrestling, or the dark side of doing this, or because you can take virtually any aspect of society, any group in society, and there is always going to be, that group is going to be dominated by mostly appropriate behaving people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter about what group it is, anything. It can be any group. And there are going to be the segment of that group that is going to be dominated by the appropriate behavior.
Yeah.
But there is also going to be a small percentage of that becomes involved in the inappropriate.
Sure.
Or what that larger part of the group determines as inappropriate.
Yeah.
And so it exists everywhere. Everywhere. There's always going to be people in society that want to stay in the safe zone, but they have a fascination with the dark zone.
Yeah, and
you know what I mean?
Yeah, and
Betty Boop is one of the first where it's really where you can use it as documented proof of society's fascination with the inappropriate, the dark side, the things that you're not supposed to like.
The
things that you're not supposed to do, that you're not supposed to dabble in. And so it goes all the way back to a time period, that really it was not equated until many decades later in the 1980s.
Yeah, Garden, you brought up earlier in today's episode, and we talked about this a few times in past episodes, Ozzy Osbourne. And like talking about the fact that he was sued, in the early 1980s over his song "Suicide Solution." I mean, back in the 1980s, Ozzy was very much considered, the devil, doing the devil's music and the devil's work. And it's funny that Ozzy was once perceived that, but today in 2025, he, especially since he did the TV show The Osbournes, has become everybody's favorite lovable goofball,
Can I point something out?
Yeah.
Can I point something out?
Sure, please do.
Okay. During Ozzy's career, he has enjoyed a lot of popularity and a lot of stardom and a lot of success.
Sure, no denying.
But when he got attacked by the PMRC, and he got attacked by that family trying to blame him for their son's suicide.
Yeah.
The effect of that skyrocketed. During his career, skyrocketed at that time.
Yeah.
So at a time when he was being attacked, all that did was serve to actually boost
his career. Yeah.
It was an attempt to stamp him down and stamp him out. And all it did was skyrocket it.
Wow.
So you really can't say he really, because when his career skyrocketed because of those attacks.
Sure.
Because the spike in his career is a gigantic spike at that time. It's not a small spike. It's a gigantic spike.
Sure. We can't deny that.
Why would society all of a sudden be so interested in him because of all of this dark and macabre that they're trying to label him with and use against him with? Why is it that society did the exact opposite?
Rebellion. Anytime you're told that's bad, you want it more. You want to check it out. Oh, let me go get that.
Well, so he would not have had the TV show. He would not have had all of these other things had he not had that gigantic spike at that time in the 1980s.
You're so right.
All of these things that you're talking about that he enjoyed, that also continued his popularity and everything.
Yeah.
He would not have had those opportunities had that not been for those attacks.
Wow.
That occurred back in the 1980s.
Yeah, you're definitely right about that, my friend. And this is we got to also talk about Gar. I emailed you about this. I don't know if you got a chance, but it said after the Hays Code, which was Hollywood's self-censored guidelines, was put into use in 1934, Betty Boop changed her tone somewhat. She was toned down. Betty's dresses were all of a sudden lengthened. Her sexual suggestive attitude was kind of toned down. And I watched some of the later cartoons, and you can kind of see this. And I laughed because I was reading in some of the later episodes, Betty Boop was considered to be like a family woman, a mom. There were a couple episodes where I don't know if she was taking care of her baby or what, but all of a sudden Betty's got a baby that she's taking care of. You never see a husband or anything. So again, for the 1930s when these things were made, that was a little risque too. And so we're never really told that it's her baby, but she's got a family. But then they're trying to mold them into kind of the best they possibly can into more family-oriented, shorts.
The same aspect of society in the 1980s that was attacking Ozzy and was attacking all of the other heavy metal artists of that time.
Yeah.
That is the same aspect of society in the 1920s that was now having a problem with Betty Boop and the racy, the inappropriateness of her character.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
The same social pressure that was occurring in the 1980s was the same social pressure that was occurring. But see, one resulted in society actually doing the opposite of the intended results.
Yeah.
But in the 1920s, they weren't trying to change society's attitude on Betty Boop, but what they were trying to do was trying to change Betty Boop to more to their conservative likings and their conservative views of the 1920s.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, like I was reading.
It was that pressure. They were putting pressure on the studios.
Well,
and what product that they could put out, and so the studios were relinquishing. But this is also another documented of how in the film industry there was a pre-code time when there was no code saying what you could do, what was appropriate for TV, what language is appropriate for movies, and all of this stuff. So Betty Boop is also another one of those markers of she was the cause of them creating these codes that control what is appropriate in TV and movies today.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about the code, the Hays Code, is it was not even other group like these groups we have today trying to censor the studios. This was the studio's way of censoring themselves. Like we've done past episodes on this. For example, there was a movie, I forget which one it was, but once they had the code, you could not say something like Jesus Christ, because people might take offense to that. Even if it was like a religious movie or something, you had to kind of tone it down. And things like this, you had to worry about all of a sudden, like if you got like a young teenage, female actress, how much skin are they allowed to show in the movie and stuff like that. And so they became very self-censored. And when they started to make these changes to Betty Boop, I was reading, The original audience for Betty Boop, they didn't like it so much. They're changing Betty Boop too much. She's not what she once was.
And that led to her decline.
Yeah.
And just like that, the lady that sued.
Yeah.
Just like she sued because her career was waning, and she was trying to blame her career waning on Betty Boop. Playing the blame game.
Yeah.
I hate the blame game, me personally, because people try to blame other people for things and that are not true. So the blame game can be used, in very nefarious ways.
Sure.
So I'm not a fan of the blame game.
Yeah.
But Betty Boop was not a human being, so we're not talking about a cartoon character blaming their career waning. But the studios were noticing that, that the popularity of, by the end of the 1930s, her popularity was starting to wane, and they started to interject her into other cartoons that had become popular in the late 30s when her career was waning.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid and I was watching these cartoons, I got to see Betty Boop making an appearance in a Popeye cartoon.
Wow.
Popeye became popular in the late 30s, and Betty Boop was waning. And I remember that was the first times that I was actually seeing Betty Boop, because I was watching a Popeye cartoon, a black and white Popeye cartoon, back in the 1960s. And lo and behold, here comes the Betty Boop, character in the Popeye.
Wow.
You see what I'm saying?
I'll have to see if I can go.
I got to experience actually seeing that and not knowing the story behind it. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But I remember it to this day.
I'll have to go online and see if I can find that Popeye episode. If I do, I'll post it on our page when this premieres next weekend for people to see. But, that has to probably been one of the first times there was kind of a crossover like that. And I was reading in the 1980s when Betty Boop kind of starting to make a comeback, become popular again. It was due to they had created like a Felix the Cat and Betty the Boop comic book, and they started having Betty Boop comic books. So once they were making no more cartoons, and that she became popular also in the comic book. So that's another aspect of a Betty Boop character,
Now, I don't know about the 1920s, but I think the popularity of comic books really started in the 1930s.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because that's the era of comic books and Superman and all of this stuff, where all of that stuff started getting introduced into pop culture.
Yeah.
But that's comic books, have an imprint on pop culture themselves.
There's no denying.
And maybe we should do an episode about comic books.
Oh, definitely, no doubt. I love that.
That is an aspect of pop culture that a lot of people don't talk about.
Yeah, because I love that idea, Gar, so much. I mean, because for a simple fact, and we've discussed this before, like, we did an episode both on the classic Batman and Superman TV shows, and we talked in both those episodes about the fact, Superman had its early cartoon version, the Max Fleischer Studios. Superman was on the radio early on. So when Superman and Batman were first being introduced on the old-time radio and stuff, people didn't really have an idea what they even looked like until they appeared in comic books, and then the TV show. Then you start, okay, so this is what Superman looks like. This is what Batman looks like. And from that point on, that's why those comic books played a big role. And, to kind of wrap up today's episode, Gar, before we do, I was reading that it said Betty Boop was one of the first ever pop culture sex symbols. So I think that's what makes Betty Boop kind of so unique. That there's really been nothing like her before or since. I mean, I think Betty Boop for a character like this really it set the standard, if you know what I mean. And I would love to have been able to ask Max Fleischer when he created Betty Boop, was this a character he created because he was looking to create a kind of boundary pushing character, or was it more maybe based on his love of jazz music? We'll just never really know that.
But the only thing anybody can do is speculate.
Yeah.
My personal speculation is,
is
I think that he found by trial and error.
Sure.
Oh my gosh, the public is, he was seeing spikes in popularity.
Yeah.
If I do this, I get a spike in popularity.
I
have a feeling it has more to do with an experimentative kind of trial and error thing that had more to do with the development of Betty Boop. I think I think that's the reason why the Betty Boop character metamorphosized also over the years, was because of those changes were really more directed at popularity spikes.
Yeah, I would tend to agree because I kind of that's kind of what I got, like thinking, like I don't think this guy created the character for a simple fact that let's have something X-rated and be racy, because that's the thing. You watch Betty Boop, and there's certain elements to it that are adult themed, as we say. It's kind of risque, but they're not so over the top where it have to be shown in a porno house, So I kind of get the same feeling that he just kind of was, let's see what we can make of this,
Well, yeah, you all of a sudden you interject the inappropriate side, and all of a sudden you see a spike.
Yeah.
You're gonna follow that spike.
Yeah, I think I think it's very interesting character too, because I think too, depending on when something is released or premieres, the world's very different. I mean, I think originally when people saw Betty Boop cartoons, they weren't necessarily looking for the adult things. It was kind of there, but it wasn't apparent to the point where everybody was saying, okay, we're not going to show these things anymore in the theater. People were enjoying them, and it just was something fun to go see, different.
Well, but also the 1920s was a very naive time period as far as because this is a time period that in Coca-Cola there was cocaine.
Yeah.
Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
This is the time period where heroin and other drugs were legal. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, we do associate, because historically, the emphasis has always been on alcohol during that time period.
Yeah.
But the 1920s also had these other things that were going on too. And the party was getting out of control, and the devastation of these drugs, and including the devastation of what alcohol can do in destroying families, destroying relationships, destroying pretty much every aspect of a person's life.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? During this time, society, really, you have to understand this.
Yeah.
In the 1920s, society thought that one guy could just tell his friend, hey, man, just get it under control. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Get a hold of yourself, man. Yeah. They didn't understand that alcohol, these people were full-blown alcoholics.
Yes. Yeah.
These people were full-blown heroin addicts.
Yeah.
These people were full-blown cocaine addicts.
There you go, yeah.
Because all of this stuff had no regulation, nothing to protect the public.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is actually what regulation is intended to do, is to protect the public.
There you go, Gar. Yeah.
There was no protections of the public back in those days. And they thought at that time that if you just told a person, hey man, just get a hold of yourself.
Yeah.
You know, blah, 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 that was really all you needed to do. You know, see what I'm saying?
Sure, I do.
Nowadays, we understand about alcoholism. Nowadays, we understand about drug addiction. Now we understand about all of these things. In the 1920s, they did not understand that. They thought they could just tell their friend, hey, man, get it together.
Wow. Yeah. Very different.
That is a drastic difference. That really shows you how society changes over the years.
Sure.
We don't tell people now, hey man, get your alcohol consumption under control. We understand.
Yeah.
My friend is a full-blown alcoholic.
Yeah.
They did not understand that in the 1920s.
Wow, yeah. See how the world is changing. And it's fun to be able to do it in these episodes with the use of pop culture, such as Betty Boop. That's why I knew this was going to be a fun, interesting episode, Gar. And just to let people know, this will premiere next Saturday. This is being recorded on Sunday, Memorial Day weekend. We hope everybody enjoys their Memorial Day holiday. And Gar, next time, it's been a while since we've done a music-related episodes. We've done episodes in the past on bands such as, Deep Purple, Alice Cooper, Black Sabbath, the Beatles, to just name a few. Well, next week, or 2 weeks from now, we're going to do our episode on a band that I know you and I equally love, Aerosmith, and we're going to be talking about the 50th anniversary of Aerosmith's album, Toys in the Attic. That's always been one of my... I love everything Aerosmith, but that's one of my all-time favorite albums they did, and maybe it's because it's the first Aerosmith album I ever heard, so that probably plays a role in that. But we're gonna talk about the songs and the album, and just 50 years of that, and all things Aerosmith.
Well, Toys in the Attic, if I remember correctly, was the album where Aerosmith really started making a name for themselves and really started garnering
airplay,
full-blown attention.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As, hey man, this is a band,
this is it.
that people need to pay attention to. It was actually Toys in the Attic that really got the ball rolling for them.
Yeah, put them on the map. They started to really get some serious.
At that time, they were an underground band.
Yeah.
Really, they were back in those days. They used to call a band had a cult following.
Cult following. There you go.
And that's another thing that's lost in fade over the years.
Yeah.
Because bands did enjoy very good careers back in the 1970s with a cult following.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And they went from...
they were not superstars, but they had a cult following, and you could make a fantastic career being a band in the 70s with a cult following.
Yeah.
Nowadays, a cult following, you're barely hanging on.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But back in the 70s, bands could make full-blown livings, have a wonderful house, be able to pay all their bills, and still live this toxic lifestyle.
Yeah, the Toxic Twins, Joe and Steven, and we're going to get into all that, Gar, but they went from just being a cult band to superstars to having a 50-year career. We're going to get into all that next time, Gar. Have a great Memorial Day weekend. Before we go, you want to say anything to the folks, Gar?
Same to you, brother, and same to everybody out there. Just let's all remember what Memorial Day is all about.
Yes, sir.
Yes, let's enjoy the barbecue. Let's enjoy all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But I think we should enjoy both. We should enjoy the barbecues, and we should also enjoy what we're actually celebrating on Memorial Day.
Yeah, those people that gave their lives so we could be here, right, Gar? To celebrate.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it's all about.
Never lose sight of that.
Take care, my friend. Another great episode in the can.
Yeah.